Today we have a special guest with us, Dr. Sameer Patil. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out time and joining us today. And it's an honor to have you with us. So, Dr. Sameer Patil is a senior fellow at ORF Mumbai, an alumnus of Jawaharlal Nehru University. He holds a PhD in international relations. Sameer Patil is a former fellow in the National Security Studies program, Gateway House. His work focuses on the intersection of technology and national security, including cybersecurity. Prior to his stint at Gateway House, he served as an assistant director at the National Security Council Secretariat in Prime Minister's Office, New Delhi, where he handled counterterrorism and national security desk. Dr. Patil is the author of Securing India in Cyber Era and has co-edited Moving Forward EU-India Relations, the significance of secure dialogues. He is also a dissertation advisor at the Naval War College, Goa. In 2019, he was a recipient of the Canberra Fellowship awarded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australia. After the 2008 Mumbai attacks, Dr. Patil took part in many Track 1 and Track 1.5 discussions, including the India-US and India-UK Strategic Intelligence Dialogues and the India-UK Track 1.5 Cyber Dialogue. So my first question to you will be, like you have served as the assistant director at the National Security Council Secretariat in the Prime Minister's office from 2008 to 13. So can you please elaborate on how counterterrorism and cybersecurity measures taken by India have changed since that time? And how are the concerns then different from the concerns now? Also, has the pandemic affected national security to a great extent with the increase in cyber attacks?
So, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this podcast. I just had a look at some of the previous episodes of this initiative. I think it's great, that you are connecting with the experts and also giving us the opportunity to present our views to the community of the students. And therefore, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of it. And now, coming to your question about cybersecurity and counterterrorism concerns from my days in the National Security Council Secretariat, I would say that looking at the issue of cybersecurity itself, uh, when I was there, I would say that cybersecurity was an emerging concern on India's threat landscape. Uh, we saw in 2010 how the infections caused by the Stuxnet virus, which was supposed to target the Iranian nuclear program, but that virus traveled through many countries, including India, and caused infections in many countries. So in India, there were a couple of infections of the critical infrastructure systems at ONGC, as well as some of the water management and energy systems. But beyond that, there was not that much a major infection. But nonetheless, that sensitized the Indian policymakers about the need to protect our critical infrastructure. Now, critical infrastructure is something which needs to be operational 24/7, and any disruption of that particular service can have implications for the welfare of the society, economy, and therefore the country as such. So in 2014, the government set up the National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center, or the NCIIPC, and that was one of the first steps that the government took towards India's cybersecurity. A year before that, we had the National Cybersecurity Policy, so which was like an umbrella document setting out the guidelines for the various cybersecurity initiatives in the country. Today, of course, cybersecurity has become a critical element of national security, and we have seen the right from the Prime Minister an emphasis on securing India in this cyber era. Not to mention the fact that today we are the second largest internet user base in the world. We have with 700 million internet users. And many of these internet users are the first generation internet users. So many of them actually lack a know-how of what to do and what not to do when it comes to the cyberspace, because they are using the internet for the first time. And of course, our adversaries have also become very advanced in their cyber capabilities. So we have had penetrating attacks coming from the Chinese state-sponsored hackers as well as the Pakistani hackers, and that is itself a step up of some of the nuisance radio attacks that used to carry a decade ago. So, which means that our cybersecurity, our cyber threat landscape today has become much more complicated because of these penetrating attacks coming from Pakistan and China. And we also seen some of the non-state actors figuring in our threat landscape. So, for instance, we have seen the Pakistan-based anti-India terrorist groups such as Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed using the cyberspace for carrying out their activities. We have seen the use of the cyberspace for recruitment and propaganda by the Islamic State, which I prefer to call as the Daesh terrorist group. So obviously, so all those factors also complicate our cybersecurity landscape. Uh, Now, linking this to counterterrorism is what I would say is that one of the big phenomena which was not present when I was there in the National Security Council Secretariat was the social media. Social media was just emerging on the scene at that time, but today social media served as our primary communication with the outside world. And as I said, that the terrorist groups are now using social media for their activities such as recruitment and propaganda. Uh, Now, after the 2008 Mumbai attacks, one of the first things that came to the attention of the Indian security establishment, even though they had kept a watch on it for a very long time, was the fact that many of the Pakistan-based groups had taken shelter in India's neighborhood, especially in countries such as Nepal and Bangladesh. So even as the glare was on the terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan, Indian security agencies worked with their counterparts in Nepal and Bangladesh to dismantle those terrorist networks and therefore deny those groups that safe haven in some of those countries. Uh, the other thing that we also saw, as I said, the rise of the Islamic State from 2013 and 14 onwards, basically out of spirit of Al Qaeda. Now, that itself was a significant challenge because for the first time we had a group which was not associated with Al Qaeda, had a different ideology than Al Qaeda, but and was operating in a different territory, which was Syria and Iraq, and was using social media prolifically, which was again not exactly a characteristic of Al Qaeda's modus operandi. So that was itself a huge challenge which for the Indian security establishment because then radicalization emerged as a big concern. And today we are seeing the rise in the lone wolf kind of operatives, terrorist suspect or terrorists who actually operate on their own because they have got self-radicalized by looking at this extremist material on the internet. So that I think is now remains a defining characteristic of India's counter-terrorism challenge. This lone wolf and the radicalization caused by the Islamic State. Uh, of course, if you look at the security situation in Jammu and Kashmir, if you compare it to a decade ago, we had many terrorist groups operating there. Today, also, those groups are operating, Hizbul Mujahideen, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and Jaish-e-Mohammed, but their ability to carry out terrorist attacks has significantly diminished because of the sustained crackdown by the security forces. So that the security situation in JNK also is, in a sense, a big change from my days in the National Security Council Secretariat. And coming to a final point about whether the pandemic has, in a sense, led to the complication of cybersecurity scenarios. Indeed, it has, because we saw a mass shift to a working from home kind of model or the WFH model. So that, in a sense, posed challenges in terms of endpoint security because many of these employees actually used to work on the company computers in the office where the IT team or the cybersecurity team was in charge of the devices security in terms of antivirus, firewalls, and those kind of things, encryption and all that. But suddenly we saw a shift in the on these home systems, which many of which were not exactly had those kind of firewalls, had no encryption, as well as not updated antivirus software. So that meant, that opened a new vulnerability in terms of India's cybersecurity posture. And we have already seen National Security Advisor Ajit Doval mentioning that there was a significant rise in cyber attacks targeting the critical infrastructure and defense infrastructure during the pandemic period. So that means, that during this entire period of pandemic, we have seen India's cybersecurity challenges getting further complicated.
Rightly said, sir. I really agree on this with you. So, as we discussed, contemporarily we are facing the perils of non-traditional military challenges. And in this regard, what are your thoughts on wars of the future? And what do you think about restructuring the Indian armed forces in such a way that country can meet these challenges?
So if you see the current developments in Ukraine, you will realize how technology is playing a very critical role in today's warfare. And I think technology will define the future of warfare from today on, from this period onwards. And I think there will be more focus on the artificial intelligence enabled systems such as drones, swarm drones, robots, and those kind of things, which in a sense would mean that they will not be used. They will be used not just in the war fighting, but also to do other kinds of tasks which are typical of a military. For instance, surveillance, for instance, bomb diffusion, and those kind of things. And I think that will now become, in a sense, will mean that you will have more human power, more human resources being released for the actual fighting. And there also we would actually see that given the aversion to the deaths on the battlefield, especially in the Western countries, we will see more robots into the battlefield because then that risk of the human casualties and the deaths and injuries will in a sense go away. Uh, what we'll also see is the elements of hybrid warfare. Now, hybrid warfare essentially is defined by the fact that it uses advanced technology. So you can look at, for instance, the artificial intelligence-enabled systems such as drones and robots as kind of advanced technologies. We also see more emphasis on disinformation and propaganda. Again, if you see what is happening in Ukraine, you will see how the Russian propaganda and the Ukrainian propaganda is trying to create their own narrative about what is actually happening on the battlefield, where the Ukrainian forces are claiming victory in some areas, whereas Russian forces are claiming victory over Ukraine, and those kind of things as well. So I think that will, in a sense, also become much more pronounced. And the third feature of this hybrid warfare is actually the use of proxies. Now, that is again something which we have seen in Ukraine, for instance, where Ukraine, for instance, had invited a lot of the foreign fighters to come and join the Ukrainian war effort. And we also saw from the Russian side how they use some of the separatist forces in the Ukrainian territory to actually fight the Ukrainian forces. So I think hybrid warfare will, in a sense, will define the future of warfare. Now, what it means for India is that we'll have to fight the battles. We cannot fight the battles in silos. So today, if we look at the domain of the battlefield domain, traditionally speaking, we had seen the air domain, the land domain, and the naval domain as the three domains. But now we have the emergence of cyber and space domains also, which means that any military which thinks of fighting a battle will have to now fight across the domains and across these theaters. So there is now more emphasis on jointness, and that is something which India has been trying to do for in the last few years. If you see the appointment of the Chief of Defense Staff, late General Bipin Rawat, and his efforts to actually create these joint commands, that in a sense indicates that India is undertaking that effort. We already have three joint commands: the Defense Cyber Agency, the Defense Space Agency, and the Andaman and Nicobar Command. So those are, in a sense, the joint command, what we call as the tri-service commands, which bring together all the three forces of the Indian military under one operational head. So we have seen that. We also seen, for instance, the move to dismantle some of the commands themselves. So, for instance, we'll be now transitioning from the Army's Northern Command, or, for instance, the Indian Navy's the Western Naval Command to a theater to theaterization. So we'll have, for instance, the Southern Theater, Western Theater, which will again bring together all the three elements of the Indian military. So that is in response to this changing nature of warfare that we are seeing. Uh, the second thing that the Indian military is doing is induction of more autonomous platforms. We've already seen much effort in terms of integrating the drones into our military inventory, and they are being primarily used for reconnaissance and surveillance purpose, particularly in the border areas, as well as if you see Indian Navy also using these long-range maritime surveillance drones. Recently, there were also reports that India is actually now Indian Army has also inducted the swarming drones for the reconnaissance purpose in the border areas with Pakistan and China. So that, in a sense, indicates that we are now laying emphasis on the autonomous systems, and our Defense Research and Development Organization, the DRDO, is also undertaking various research initiatives to go deep into these kind of technologies and how they can be utilized further. And much of this actually, also stems from what China is doing. Since 2015, China's People's Liberation Army has been undergoing a lot of intense military reforms, and India is also looking at that particular experiment and learning lessons from that. Uh, the last part of this is actually, the utilization of what we call as the startup and the innovation ecosystem, and that is something which again we are realizing that that world over there is a move to induct private sector into the defense research. So no longer the state-owned bodies or state-backed bodies are doing the defense research, and they are no longer being treated as like a restricted kind of a domain, but we are now inviting the startups and the other innovation ecosystem that we have uh, to actually innovate some of the technologies that the Indian military needs, because many of these technologies, require an out-of-box thinking, and typically speaking, startups and the innovators actually demonstrate that kind of an attitude. So we are also doing that in terms of harnessing that particular potential for our own defense technologies, and ultimately the aim, as we have seen repeatedly from the policymakers, is to actually attain the self-reliance in defense production, because again that is something which is one of the fundamental key learnings of all this, is that unless a nation is self-reliant in defense production and defense manufacturing, that will still open a vulnerability in terms of dependence on the foreign arms supplies. Again, what we are seeing, for instance, in Ukraine, that Ukraine, despite having some kind of a domestic defense industrial base, is still relying on the Western countries for the military assistance and in terms of the military equipment.
Sir, like since we are talking about Ukraine, so this brings me to my next question. In tandem with cybersecurity, you have also written a lot about nuclear weapons. In a nuclear weapons inventory report published this year by Swedish armed watchdog SIPRI, it is estimated that China has 50 operational warheads, while India and Pakistan have 160 and 165 operational warheads, respectively. You also cited in this report in an article that you recently wrote, where you rightly point out, and I quote, that today Southern Asia is in the midst of an arms race, and rightly so. From Russia's flexing of its nuclear weaponry early on in the Ukraine war to China's rapid extension of their nuclear arsenal, there are naturally growing worries in Asia. In this regard, how do you think India is coping with these concerns in terms of nuclear research and development? And do you think India is prepared to meet the possible challenges in the immediate future?
So, in a sense, the nuclear dynamics of Southern Asia are, in a sense, intricately linked to the larger geopolitical dynamics. And there, I think I'm flagging two important developments. One is the breakdown of the U.S. and Russia arms control negotiations, not just bilateral but also at the multilateral level. So, for instance, recently we had the NPT review conference. As you know, the NPT was indefinitely extended in 1995, and since then the review conference, which is held every 5 years, is actually tries to produce a consensus document, which is in a sense a nuclear powers view, or the nuclear weapon states view of the current geopolitical dynamics. But at this recently concluded 10th NPT review conference, the nuclear weapon states actually failed to produce a consensus document. And even though previously we have had such instances of the failure to reach a consensus, but in these times it's significant because, as many analysts have said, that we are actually in the new Cold War era, where there is, in a sense, a schism emerging between the United States led Western camp and the Russia led Eastern camp, or Russia and China led Eastern camp. So that, in a sense, is the fundamental feature of current geopolitics, that there is a breakdown of dialogue between the United States and Russia, and that manifests also in the arms control negotiations. So even though, for instance, both the countries salvaged one existing bilateral arms control agreement, which was the New START Treaty, the way back in last year in 2021, that in a sense is not changing the larger dynamics of the US-Russia arms control and the breakdown of dialogue there. Now, combine this with what we're seeing also is the big prospects of the nuclear disarmament. So even though every country is putting especially the Western countries, or especially the US and Russia, which actually hold 90% of the current nuclear arsenal in the world, even though they are engaging in the rhetoric of nuclear disarmament, they are not taking any steps to give up their nuclear weapons. Now, the US-Russia dynamics are also driving the Chinese nuclear modernization, and whatever China is doing is also getting reflected into the Indian threat perception. So, in a sense, that is how the Indian nuclear modernization is interlinked to what is happening in the larger space. So. We had, for instance, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into effect in February 2021. But again, none of the nuclear powers are signatory to it. So even though there is a treaty which actually prohibits the possession of nuclear weapons, the countries which actually possess the nuclear weapons are not party to it. So that, in a sense, shows that even though there are these treaties which are emerging out of negotiations, they are actually becoming irrelevant to the current geopolitical reality. So it is in this context, India is undertaking the nuclear modernization, and our stated strategy is a credible minimum deterrence, which means that as second or third generation nuclear powers, we are not actually going to go for nuclear warheads into thousands, or the nuclear arsenal into thousands of weapons. Today also, if you see, for instance, US and Russia hold nuclear warheads to the tune of 4,000 to 5,000 warheads. We are not going to do that. So currently, our strength, our nuclear arsenal is limited to 160, and I think that is, and the policymakers think that it is sufficient to actually deter our adversaries from engaging into any kind of military or nuclear mischief. So, given this credible minimum deterrence that we have, what we're also trying to achieve is a nuclear triad. So we are now having a nuclear strike capability in the land domain, in the air domain, as well as in the naval domain. And we are also consistently advancing the quality of the existing arsenal. So what we call as canisterization, that we can launch the missiles through the canisters, as well as multiple independent re-entry vehicles, so the MER technology, so that a single warhead can fire multiple projectiles. So that, in a sense, is in a sense becoming a defining feature of India's nuclear modernization, which is reflective of what is happening in the larger space. And along with that, what we're also doing is that since 1998, or since the India-US nuclear agreement, we are in a sense emerging as one of the stakeholders in the in the international arms control setting. So unlike the previous approach of our diplomacy, where we used to constantly berate the Western countries for managing the arms control issues on their own, we are now actually becoming a stakeholder there, and we are ensuring that we actually try to shape some of the rules and norms governing some of these weapon systems, as well as some of the emerging technologies such as cyber, AI, blockchain, and those kind of things.
Thank you, sir. So, we all know like what happened in Afghanistan last year, and last month the Taliban regime has completed 1 year, and still no country has officially recognized its rule. So, regarding this, I have like two questions. One, a rushed US exit from Afghanistan with the help of Pakistan, and the return of a hardline Islamic of Pakistan, and the return of a hardline Islamic Sharia based government in power. Do you think Pakistan will use Afghanistan's soil to plot terrorists more freely? And second is, in one of your articles, you said, and I quote, that the course of events in Afghanistan since August 2021 have led India to adopt a flexible and pragmatic approach to the country. Can you explain this flexible and pragmatic approach that you have mentioned?
So first of all, about the terrorism scenario in Afghanistan, I think it's important to note that Pakistan is currently grey listed by the Financial Action Task Force. So that means that whatever action Pakistan undertakes in support of any terrorist group or any terrorist movement will come under the scrutiny of the FATF, and that in a sense risks more punitive measures against Pakistan. And in that sense, Afghanistan actually, in a sense, provides the necessary, what should I say, diversion for Pakistan, because Pakistan can actually divert some of the terrorist groups based on soil to Afghanistan, and we have seen that constantly in the on the ground reports which are coming from the UN. Sanctions monitoring team in Afghanistan, which has noted for a very long time that Pakistan headquarters anti-India terrorist groups such as Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed have actually taken shelter in Afghanistan in close proximity with Al Qaeda and the Haqqani network, especially in Nangarhar and Kunar province. So that just shows, that Pakistan is actually, as you said, plowing some of the terrorists into Afghanistan. Now. India has highlighted that possibility of Afghanistan again emerging as a terrorist safe haven. In fact, one of the first meetings which India had with the Taliban officials, uh, this issue actually came up, and this issue was highlighted by the Indian diplomats that they do not want Afghanistan to emerge as a terrorist safe haven as it was when it was under the previously under the Taliban rule. Now, looking at that approach of India, I think in a sense I would say it's a very nuanced approach that without giving the due recognition to the Taliban regime in power, because we still consider it as a terrorist group, and the fact is that even the Taliban cabinet, the interim cabinet, so-called interim cabinet, has many United Nations designated terrorists in that particular cabinet. So we do not recognize that Taliban government, and if you look at again other external stakeholders, many of the external stakeholders, including Pakistan, have also not recognized this particular regime. But at the same time, given the history of India's engagement in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades, since the U.S. Military operations began in Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, uh, we had always focused on the humanitarian assistance part. Now that meant that we had to, in a sense, there was that critical gap which had emerged after the fall of the Ashraf Ghani government and the emergence of Taliban and the return of Taliban to Kabul, that uh, suddenly with the exit of the United States and many of the foreign donors, uh, Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis was getting worsened. So they needed food, they needed access to some of the basic medical facilities and those kind of things. And I think India has capitalized on that. That without recognizing the Taliban regime, we have shown our readiness to provide humanitarian assistance to the Afghan people, and we have seen that in the form of the provision of the COVID-19 vaccines to the Afghan civilians, as well as the food aid which India has sent to Kabul. Uh, and that, I think, in a sense, is what I'm trying to say. That India has had this nuanced approach that, in a sense, it wants to it wants to demonstrate that that it opposes the Taliban regime, but it does not oppose the Afghan civilians or the Afghan population as such, and therefore it is trying to work out this way of working with some of the aid agencies which are still on the ground, and ensure that some of the needs of the Afghan civilians are met, which is also the reason why India has also decided to reopen the embassy in Kabul, even with the minimal staff, because we want to ensure that we can give some of the emergency visas for the Afghan nationals who want to travel to India for medical, education, and those kind of things. And mind you, uh, this humanitarian assistance not just is on the Afghan territory; it's also on the Indian side. For instance, at the time of the fall of Kabul to Taliban, we had some of the Afghan military candidates undergoing training here at some of the Indian military academies. Now, once they completed training, they were hesitant to go back to Afghanistan. So India has actually absorbed many of these cadets and given them another training program so that they can remain on the Indian soil for some time, and till the time actually the situation in Afghanistan stabilizes. So that is how India has, in a sense, worked out a very nuanced approach in the last 1 year that the Taliban has come back to Kabul.
So since we have been talking about India's and Afghan policy and terrorist outfits emerging out of Pakistan, I would also like to highlight some internal security issues. And this is a question it's a follow up question to the previous question. The recent targeted killings of civilians and attacks on security personnel have raised concerns in the security fraternity. However, the numbers show otherwise. I would like to know from you what is the status of security apparatus in Jammu and Kashmir and how the government is strategizing and dealing with cross border militant infiltration as well.
So I would actually say that this is actually one of the best time to visit Kashmir and see the situation by yourself, because in the last 3 years the security situation in Kashmir has improved dramatically. Uh, so as I said, that some of the offshoots which are operating there, the Lashkar, some of the offshoots of the pan-Islamic terrorist groups such as the Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, they have their local franchises operating in the Kashmir Valley. And we also have the Pakistan-based groups such as the Hizbul Mujahideen, LET, and JEM. They're also operating. But their ability to actually carry out terrorist violence has considerably reduced. So after the suicide attack on the CRPF convoy in Pulwama in February 2019, we have not seen a major attack being carried out by these terrorist groups, which again is a testimony to the crackdown by the security forces, which have diminished their capability as well as the top leadership of this group to engage into any kind of terrorist violence, which is why they have been now reduced to carry out these random acts of targeted violence, targeting the religious minorities, the laborers, the outside laborers, the Sikhs, and those sections which are actually not exactly in a sense, what should I say, they're not secure targets, right? So they remain vulnerable to the terrorist violence, and the terrorist groups actually are finding the right opportunity to just go and target them. That does not need any kind of planning. That does not need any kind of prior surveillance. So that is now how what the terrorist groups are reduced to. That from the heydays of the terrorist violence, they are actually now reduced to carrying out these random acts of violence, which surely gives them some kind of publicity. But in the longer run, it actually weakens their cause, because now even some of the local Kashmiris are actually accusing these groups of, disturbing the peace in the Kashmir Valley, which has now become, in a sense, a prevalent situation in the last 3 years. Even on the infiltration front, we have seen a consistent to fall in the infiltration figures, and that's because of the three-tiered counter-infiltration grid which India has raised in the last 10 years. So we have the first tier of the Indian Army, the second tier of the paramilitary, such as the CRPF or the Border Security Force, and the third pillar of the local Jammu and Kashmir police. So any terrorist who tries to infiltrate into the Kashmir Valley has to pass these 3 tiers, but in trying to do so, he actually gets eliminated by one of the weapon of the tiers. So that, in a sense, has also affected the infiltration happening from the line of control and on the international border. And last year, the Taliban's return, in a sense, provided some kind of a temporary momentum to these groups. And it was expected that probably they will engage in more violence, but that has proved just that, a temporary momentum. So after the euphoria over the return of Taliban settled down, these groups, were back to doing these random acts and not really exactly engage in major kind of violence. Uh, Having said that, I think one concern which remains for the Indian security, or two concerns which remain for the Indian security forces. One is the radicalization, and I think that will involve a longer term work in terms of countering, how the youth want to undertake the path of violence and therefore get radicalized by social media and some of the material which comes from the religious seminaries. Uh, and second is the challenge of the anti-India propaganda carried out by Pakistan. And countering that kind of propaganda requires a national effort. So even the security forces in the valley are undertaking an effort to create an alternate narrative and countering that litany of lies coming from Pakistan. Actually, that effort needs to be should I say amplified nationally so that we can defeat this information warfare which is coming from Pakistan side.
Rightly said, sir. I completely agree. And we often hear about like dark web or darknet. So this brings me to my next question. That physical cross-border militant infiltration is just one part of modern terrorism. Terrorist outfits have devised new and more advances strategies for procurement of arms, sales of narcotics, and currency transfers with the help of darknet. Websites like the Onion Router, Toshka, and Empire have been a menace to cybersecurity. As these websites are anonymous and bypass government surveillance, so I would like to know from you what you think should be India's approach to tackling darknet porn threats.
So, as I said, in the darknet by nature is anonymous and encrypted. So first thing that we will actually need to require is to train the security forces and the law and order machinery to to first of all know about the phenomenon, because one of the first things that we see when it comes to darknet is just the absence of awareness about that this kind of internet exists and this kind of internet is accessible by millions of people and millions of Indians who actually engage in all sorts of nefarious activities. So first, the thing that we will need to do is the training of the police and the security forces, and some of the states are actually leading effort on that, and so are the intelligence agencies, which have now realized that these kind of activities are happening. The second is to actually upgrade our forensic capability. Again, that is something which is a work in progress. So in the last few months, the Ministry of Home Affairs has announced a significant upgrading of India's cyber forensics capability. So the aim is to actually open one major cyber forensic facility in every state capital. So that at least that every state capital gets that kind of facility, which in a sense will help them to access this kind of material and ensure that they're able to interdict some of these activities there. And the third thing that India will need to do is the 90% of the activities in the darknet are related to the drug smuggling. So, which means that even though the buying and selling of the drugs may happen on the darknet, the actual delivery happens physically, which means that we will need to ensure that the Narcotics Control Bureau can actually go back to the darknet and see what kind of activities which are happening, and then link it to the physical activities which are happening on the ground, so that it can interdict those drug consignments. Again, that is something which the Narcotics Control Bureau has realized, and we are seeing now in the last few years a gradual rise in cases of the consignments which are being sold on the darknet but being interacted by the Narcotics Control Bureau, which means that they're able to link those things with what is happening on the darknet.
Thank you, sir, for this insight. This brings me to the last question of the session: that how will the technological competence of the world shape international geopolitics over the next few decades?
So there's a very, I would say, a very simple answer to that, which is basically that technology is actually becoming the is becoming the primary factor in shaping the alliances now. So if you see, for instance, Quad is actually, maybe a collaboration of the democracies, but it is actually what we call as a collaboration of techno-democracies. Techno-democracies means liberal democracies which are leading economies, but also have an advanced tech sector. And if you look at India, US, Russia, Japan, and Australia, each can be considered a techno-democracy in its own right. So that is something which is now going to define the geopolitical alignments. We already saw that, for instance, in the proposal which was brought up by the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who spoke about the D10, that democracy 10, that basically meant that that democracies of the world need to come together to collaborate on some of the emerging technologies such as 5G and avoid the kind of disruptions which may cause because of our overdependence on single sources. In this case, it would be China. So that is something which, in a sense, is going to define the contemporary geopolitics. And if you see on the other side, that's also true. For instance, Russia and China are today coming together to collaborate on some of the emerging technologies. President Putin has already said that anyone who controls the artificial intelligence will rule the world. So, which means that they are also looking at some of these emerging technologies to solidify their lead. And the fact is that today there is the kind of R&D which used to happen, especially in the West, especially in the United States, on some of these emerging technologies. The US is actually losing that particular competitive advantage, because over the years there has been what should I say, a reduction in funding which goes into the R&D, and consequently what we have seen is that, as I mentioned, one is Russia and China trying to take the lead on this, but also the private sector. So today, for instance, quantum computing, right? Quantum computing is where the US private sector is much more advanced than the actual the US defense industry, and that just shows that unless you do a sustained effort in doing this R&D on some of these emerging technologies, you will not be able to achieve that expertise. And again, the sheer scale of tech advancement means that if you do it on your own, it will be difficult for you to bridge that gap, which is why, for instance, China and Russia are coming together. So, which is why, for instance, the people on the other side are saying, the democracies need to come together so that we can pool in the resources. Now, with COVID-19, what has happened is that, that many of the national economies have undergone strain. So, there is a challenge of resource mobilization also. So, in this case, if all the democracies come together, pool their resources, they will be able to do a job better than actually doing it on their own, and therefore losing that competition. So I think technology is going to define international relations in the coming decades together.
Rightly said, sir. And thank you so much for this wonderful and insightful session. And thank you for sharing your thoughts on cybersecurity and national security. It was an honor to have you, and it was my honor to interview you. Thank you so much.